So this analysis will consider the ethical dimensions of freedom of speech in the college classroom, and we will be applying the Markula model to a recent case out of the University of Louisville, Kentucky. This presentation is a companion to the paper that was submitted last night, which does include an extensive literature review, and I've included references to those philosophers on my reference slide at the end of this presentation. I want to get right to the case study, which involves the circulation of an anti-gay pamphlet at the University of Louisville. The facts, the testimony of the case: in late January 2020, there was an unnamed fifth year engineering student who entered Assistant Professor Kayla Story's Introduction to LGBTQ Studies class a few minutes before class began and placed copies of a pamphlet called God and Sexuality on students' desks. The student was not enrolled in the course. And even the wording of that first bullet is interesting. I say that he entered the class before it begins. So we're met with this philosophical quandary. Is it a class before it begins, or is it a class as students are filing into it? We're going to get to that. But when the student finishes distributing the materials, he exits the classroom before class begins and remains in the hallway throughout the session. Dr. Story would say later in testimony that she thought that he was lurking, and it was, to the point where she actually could not focus on the session at hand. And she actually leaves the room before the class ends, confronts the student in the hallway, admits distributing the pamphlets, but refuses to give his name. And Dr. Story tells the student that in those, he's actually limited to campus free speech zones, which it becomes kind of problematic because there are points in policy documents from the university that explicitly don't acknowledge the existence of free speech zones. But the student said that his status as a paying student meant that he could distribute them anywhere. So Dr. Story said that she was going to call campus authorities. The student leaves, but he ends up coming back 2 days later and waits outside the classroom. By this point, campus police were stationed, and they had relayed to Dr. Story that the student wished to speak to her. Dr. Story declined, and at her request, officers escorted the student away. So there was immediate fallout from this. Dr. Story is a part of two departments at the institution: Pan-African Studies and LGBTQ Studies, and the chairs of each lobbied for her, took her issue, tried to go to the president, but Nila Bendapunti, that she was out with pneumonia. So they went to the dean of students, and initially they were hamstrung. The classes, technically, in their view, were not disrupted. Therefore, there was very little they can do. And they actually initially said that they evaluated the student's well-being and thought that he was okay because he was called by God, to use his words, and was recently married and bought a house, so he had to have been of sound mind. So apparently that's the criterion that they used. And they actually okayed him returning to Dr. Story's class to do this, provided that he gave her 48 hours advance notice. So clearly this was not okay with Dr. Story. She and her students actually were planning to protest. Like I said, the president was out with pneumonia. She comes back, Dr. Nila Bendapunti, and is initially hesitant to promise more than she can reach. And she consulted her media relations director, who said that the pamphlets did not constitute hate speech. But the more that Dr. Bendapunti did with this, she met with students, she met with Dr. Story, she heard them, she listened to them, and within a week, she initiates a reversal. But even after that first meeting, she was still hesitant. She was trying to collect evidence. She was trying to make a reasoned decision. And she, even before she decided to do the reversal, promised Dr. Story that there would be a campus police officer outside her door for the remainder of the term. So she ends up issuing a reversal, which basically means that the student could no longer have communication with Dr. Story, with the class, or with any students in the class. No ifs, ands, or buts. So that was a welcome solution on the part of Dr. Story's chairs, on the part of Dr. Story herself, on the part of the class. But there was a conservative backlash that ended up happening at the reversal. Dr. Ricky Jones, who is the Pan-African Studies chair, he had always argued that the presence of a threat to Dr. Story and even the class, the students, overrode the concerns of this fifth-year engineering student's rights to free expression. The initial screening, again, the Office of the Dean of Students, one of the campus administrators from that office who screened or evaluated the student with apparently no psychological training or basis, in fact, used the criterion of his marriage and mortgage to assess that he had to have been of sound mind. And the student in that meeting said that he was called by God to do this. So the school actually had always followed the Campus Free Speech Protection Statute, technically a statute, copyright 2019. I include that on my reference list. It does not mention free speech zones, which actually challenged Dr. Story's initial response to the student. The university's Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities is drawing attention to place, manner, and time restrictions of student demonstrations in areas not traditionally used as an open public forum. That was most recently published in July 2020, and I have a feeling that it was rewritten to, in the consequences of this incident, although I was not able to verify that. The university's Code of Student Conduct apparently was the use for justification of the reversal on this idea that the functioning of the institution was not able to occur, which draws attention to this process of a fade out and a fade in of a classroom. When a class lets out and students are filing in, what does that space of the classroom become in that moment? So using the Markula model, there are 5 sources of ethical standards: the utilitarian approach, the rights approach, the fairness or justice approach, the common good approach, and the virtue approach. And based on my evaluation of this case and the Markula model, I would detect that these 2 sources, utilitarian and rights, perhaps have the most direct applicability here. If we were to define utilitarian as the ethical action that produces the greatest good and does the least harm for all who are affected, we would be compelled to consider that the student who distributed the pamphlets left the room before the class began, thereby removing immediate harm and ensuring at least the class's physical safety. The students had the opportunity either to choose not to read the material and or to throw it away. Dr. Story could have used the material as a teachable moment and actively deconstructed the practice and the literature as part of a larger lesson on recognizing homophobia and religious bigotry. Now, that's obviously asking a lot, and it's taking for granted that the student would not come, enter the classroom violently, perhaps, if he thought that they were disparaging him or throwing away the materials. So, there are a lot of what ifs that can challenge that. But at the same time, if we were to just look at the above considerations on their face and remember Cohen, who was one of my authors in the literature review, can we prove a wrongful hurt? Cohen's interpretation of John Stuart Mill argued that free speech can be interfered with in instances where a wrongful hurt is occurring, on the idea that psychological harms are a real consequence to that wrongful hurt. So given the above considerations, do we think that that is legitimate? Or can we look at the above considerations and think that the greatest good for all would be that if the classroom had the opportunity to turn it to a teachable moment, if the student felt that he did what he had to do and that they weren't disparaging him, he would be less likely to return to the class. Did a utilitarian approach present itself by that technique? So the Office of the Dean of Students, could they have, even by default, stumbled into the utilitarian approach? That's something to consider. The rights approach, which could be defined as a focus on the ethical action that best protects and respects the moral rights of those affected. In that regard, if we were to consider that the classes and professors' moral rights were not being respected here, the student's moral rights are not being violated if he cannot enter a classroom moments before a class in which he is not enrolled, is about to start. If we also consider the disruption of free choice is something that is meant to be there. People who were enrolled in the class, who paid money to be in the class, they did not ask to experience that hardship. So we open up the idea that the student could have gone through other avenues to protest the existence of the class if that's what he thought, for him to enter a class which he was not paying, that appears to be a rights violation. Indeed, the student's distribution of the materials in the moments before class time was interfering with the functioning of the university's ability to transition students between classes. So this is taken from this idea of the university's policy, which may or may not have been tailored in July of 2020, 6 months after the initial event. And this also appears on the reference list. So if we were to consider that the anti-gay materials can reasonably create a hardship more than an annoyance, then what we have here is an immediate countervailing of the student's rights to safety, choice, and agency. So recommendations for campus leaders. From the utilitarian approach, you could invite students to conduct research and reflection projects about the experience, to design surface learning opportunities that can hopefully reframe the experience and empower them, as well as the professor. And that is asking a lot. But at the same time, the rights approach would be a little bit more solid. Improve the screening of students deemed physically threatening, which is what Dr. Story's testimony attested to. Ground this psychological basis that does not include criterion of marriages or mortgages, right? The institution could also craft policies for students who wish to protest current courses on the books, but create ways in which the student views could be expressed, not entering or occupying, because that's really what it was. It was an occupation of the classroom, even if it was in that nexus point between the fade out of a class and the fade in of a new one. And also revisit human resource language on workplace safety and solicit faculty input to cover these scenarios. If we were to consider them on the front lines of the institution's business, perhaps no more, no less than registrar or anyone behind the counter or student services, but at the same time, they are in large groups of people, and there can be situations where things get emotional and arguably the threat of violence presents itself. How are the Office of Human Resources, how can they ground procedure, policy, some sort of framework about workplace safety to solicit, and how can HR solicit faculty involvement to cover these types of unique scenarios? So questions for reflection. Given the distribution of the pamphlets in the moments before class started, is it reasonable to assume that the discovery would spill over into the start of class time and thus divert student and professor focus from the course content? If so, wouldn't this mean that the teaching of the course has been disrupted, even though it wasn't during class? Why or why not? Second question, under what condition or conditions would the engineering student be right to claim that his moral rights were violated? Did those conditions occur here? Why or why not? And I'm going to leave my reference list up for a second. I highly encourage you to consult Cohen and Muldoon that comprise my literature review. They appear a lot more heavily in the actual paper itself. But thank you all for paying attention.